Mr. Willingham here, and in this video, I'm going to be introducing you to the idea of lists in Python. Before we get started, I want to show you how you can get these show notes for yourself. There are two good links here. If you have access to a Google account, I would recommend using this second option. This will open up the show notes in Google Colab. You'll already be able to see and mess with the show notes. You'll be able to run the code examples as long as you're logged in to a Google account. If you don't have access to that, or if you would prefer to use Jupyter Notebook directly, you can go to GitHub, and the show notes are available there as well. This is also a decent place if you just want to come through to browse the show notes, but you can actually download this and edit this Jupyter Notebook on your own. So we'll dive right in. First off, the objectives for this series, I've got two audiences in mind. First off, mostly focused on people that are new to coding and new to Python. So this is their first time learning Python. You've already done some of the basics at this point, and now you're ready to learn about lists. And I've also got in mind some people that maybe have more experience with programming, possibly with other languages, but maybe you're new to Python. So hopefully I can serve both of you. For this first part of the series, part one, I'm going to be talking about what lists are in general. That applies not just in Python, but really to any language. And we'll also look at how to create a list in Python. I do suggest, again, before you start this series, you've already done, the classic Hello World program in Python. And you've already done some basic variables and assignments, done some basic arithmetic. You've printed out some results of variables. Maybe you've even done user input already at this point. It's okay if you've not done that yet. And maybe you've even done some joining of strings. Maybe you even know it's called concatenation. Possibly not, right? But at least you've covered a hello world, some basic variables, some assignments. So again, num1 equals 19. If you think you know how to do that, and you think you know how to add up and print out variables like this, then you're ready for this series. So we'll dive right in. Lists. Lists are just collections of items, and typically the way you might be familiar with using them would be with possibly a to-do list or a grocery list, a list that you've made to help you get your work done in your own time. So a classic example with a grocery list here, you're going to go to the store to buy sugar, milk, bread, and spinach. So it's a collection of items that you'd like to purchase from the store. When we're talking about programming and computer science, lists are a data structure, which means they're a way of storing information, a way of storing data. You've already looked at some basic variables like integers and strings. Those are also ways of storing information. Well, lists are a little bit more powerful, I suppose we can say, in that they are a collection of data. So specifically, a Python list is an ordered collection of any data types that you want it to hold. So a list can be a collection of integers or strings. I'll scroll down to the examples. Groceries is the name of a variable, and we've assigned it a list of strings in this case. So groceries is a list, and that means in this case that it's a collection of strings, specifically a collection of strings that describe the items that perhaps you want to purchase at the store. So apples, milk, bread, paper towels. Those are 4 separate strings, but we've stored them in a single variable by using this list data structure. Same for roster. It's a collection of strings. In this case, they're names, but we've got 5 separate names, 5 separate strings held in this data structure called a list. For grades, this time they're integers, and each integer is its own piece of information, piece of data, and they've been collected in this data structure called a list. And of course, you can also have decimals or floats. You can store those in a collection as well. So remember that lists are a collection of data, typically strings or integers or floats, though they can store other types as well. And in fact, a list can be a list of lists. We won't cover that in this series, but that's more common than you might imagine, actually. So let's move on. We make a list, as you see here, by naming a variable. So groceries is an example. Using the assignment operator, which you think of as the equal sign, some square brackets, and then each value separated by a comma. One of the first things you'll do after you make a list is simply print it out, right? So I'm going to go ahead and do that example now. If I run this code, well, you didn't really see anything happen. So how about I come up here and I change this? We'll assume this person maybe missed an assignment and then did really well on a quiz there. Let's go run this again so you get to see what happens. When it prints the list, which was called grades up here, you can see all of the values with the commas and the square bracket. That's what comes out of the output when we're done. Remember, this is the same place where you saw your hello world print out whenever you happen to have done that, right? But when we print a list, we get the square brackets, the values, and the commas, all of it. Each of those things that prints, each one of those things separated by a comma, well, I'm not going to call them things or items anymore. They have a name. Each one is called an element. So in the case of grades up here, 85 is one element. 90 is one element of the list. I've got a couple examples here. So the periodic table holds, well, elements, meaning something different in that case, right? But in this example, periodic table is a list. It's a collection with 4 strings in it. And each of those 4 strings happens to be the symbol for an element on the periodic table. And also each one of those is an element in the list. To be less confusing here, how about the grocery list example? So there are 3 elements in the grocery list here: dozen eggs, bread, and milk. Each of those is one element in the list. So we have 3 elements total. And then this grades list has 6 integers in it. Each one of them is an element. So 78 is an element in this list. So I'll back up for a second. We saw when we printed out a list, it looks like this with square brackets and commas. That's fine. However, we tend to like to do something a little bit nicer. The square brackets and the commas is fine sometimes, but we tend to like to use what's called a for loop. And perhaps you've already been exposed to this, but I'll run this example. I'm actually going to comment that line of code out. And what you'll see when I run that code is each line has a single element from the list printed on it. And that's not the only option when we use a for loop. You can actually do whatever you want when you print out using a for loop, but this is a common option that will follow. So the way the for loop works, you start with the word for, lowercase, then you have a variable here. In this case, I called it element, but actually you can call it anything. I'll leave it called element for now. Element is a variable that does not need to exist until this moment. We're making it right now for the for loop. So I'm saying for element in grades. Well, grades is the list that we made up here. So that's what grades is. So again, what is element exactly? Well, element refers to each individual element in the list. So each time this loop repeats, it's going to have the first time it'll have 85 in it, because it's the first element. But when the loop repeats again, it'll have 90. And actually you can see that down here. So for element in grades, if I was going to change that to read more like a plain English sentence, I might say something like, for each element in the list of grades. For each element in the list of grades. And then what are we going to do? Well, we're going to print out that one element. And then the loop will repeat until it gets to the end of the list. And one of the reasons why for loops are nice is because they allow you to do simply this with just some neater printing rather than printing the whole list with square brackets and commas and everything. But the real true power here is that we can actually do something else each time we run through, and that something else might involve perhaps that number or that string. The value of that element might be part of this something else. There might be some calculation, there might be some fancy business that we do there. So this allows us to take each element, print it out neatly if that's what we want, or maybe do something else with each individual element. So for loops, you'll see these a lot. I'm going to wrap up this video with the idea of string concatenation. just as a concrete example of why you might use a for loop with a list. So in this case, it's a roster. So that means it's got a collection of probably student names, possibly from a class, and I want to print out maybe a welcome message for each student. Yeah. So when I run this code, which I've already done, you can see the output here. We see we see literally the list. That's because right there on line 1, I printed the whole list. So print whole list. And then later on, we'll see print with for loop. Right? So when the output down here, we start by printing the whole list. And that's why you see square brackets and commas and the quotation marks. But then the magic is this. Hello, comma, space, James. Hello, comma, space, Jane, etc. So specifically where you may have run into this is if you've ever needed to maybe print out stickers for a class to put student names on items, or if you've ever needed to print out address stickers, address stamp stickers for envelopes. This is the kind of structure you would use for that. This for loop allows us to create or form a message by concatenating, which just means joining, each individual string. So again, the word is concatenate, but it just means to join. And so in this case, it takes the string hello, comma, space. We add to that the string, which is one name from the list. And then we add to that an exclamation point. And then that's what we're going to print out here. And then again, the for loop will run through for each person. And here's just another example, same idea. We've got a list here, and we're going to use a for loop to print out a message for each value in that list. And you might be able to imagine here that we could be more sophisticated than this. If the list kept track of maybe just a little bit of extra information, maybe we were able to keep track of not just the number, the grade, but possibly also keep track of which class they earned that grade in. Well, then this for loop would be able to say, you earned an 85 in science. You earned a 90 in math. You earned a 78 in Spanish, right? So in that case, you can imagine that this has the potential to be very powerful. So at this point, this video is done, and I want you to go and experiment on your own, trying out these for loop examples, see if you can come up with your own list, create your own collection of data, see if you can print it out with a for loop, maybe try some of these string concatenation examples, which again sounds fancy, but it's really just joining strings together to create a nicer message that will print out. And if you want, feel free to look ahead to part 2, which will be coming up soon.